In this next section of your notes, we are going to discuss feeding relationships. Overall, there are three main types of feeding relationships. There can be a parasite-host relationship, for example, a tapeworm, where one species, the parasite, would benefit from the other, while the host would be harmed in the process. Just like how the tapeworm robs your body of nutrients while living in your digestive tract until you learn of it being there and can get it killed and expelled. There's also producer-consumer relationships and predator-prey relationships. When we refer to producers, we're talking about all autotrophs, or plants, that trap energy from the sun and make their own food. We refer to these producers as being at the bottom of the food chain. As for consumers, these are organisms that are heterotrophs that need to ingest other nutrients in order to sustain their lives. Examples of the different types of consumers include herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, decomposers, and scavengers. When we refer to an herbivore, we are talking about a consumer that eats producers or plants, just like a tortoise. When we refer to carnivores, they are organisms that are predators that will hunt their prey for food and typically eat meat, just like great white sharks and lions. Scavengers are organisms that feed on dead and decaying animals that we refer to as carrion, and these are typically larger animals like turkey vultures. Omnivores are organisms that eat both plants and animals like raccoons. In the last unit, we talked about bacterial decomposers, and when we refer to decomposers, we're talking about tiny organisms that will break down dead and decaying plants and animals into simple molecules to return those nutrients back into the ecosystem. So when they are consuming these dead and decaying organic matter, it helps to speed up composition, and this is why, as we referred to before, why we're not trudging through the forest through stacks and stacks of dead leaves. They're decomposed, so we have that space available. Decomposers can also be referred to as detritivores, and examples of these can be bacteria, fungus, and some various insects. So now when we talk about these different consumers and producers and their eating habits, we can refer to trophic levels. So this is where we're going to start in talking about food chains and food webs. So when we talk about these different trophic levels, we're just referring to models that show how matter and energy will move through an ecosystem. A chain refers to the straight line of those different trophic levels, where the arrows are pointing towards the consumer in that system. So this is essentially pointing from the organism towards the eater. So each of those links within the food chain is known as a trophic level. And each of those trophic levels are a step in the transfer of energy within an ecosystem. Within those trophic levels, we refer to the different levels of consumers. So we can refer to primary consumers as the herbivores that eat plants. When we discuss secondary and tertiary consumers, we're talking about carnivores or those predatory animals that eat prey animals. So ultimately, when you think of these trophic levels as a food pyramid, we have producers at the bottom of the pyramid because they are most numerous. And as we work our way up, we have the primary consumers that eat the producers, secondary consumers that eat the primary consumers, tertiary consumers that eat the secondary, and if you were to take it a level beyond that, we refer to those consumers as quaternary consumers. So within these trophic levels, we can actually measure the amount of organic matter that's within these different levels. And we refer to that measurable matter as biomass. So as you move up through the food chain, the energy and the biomass actually decrease. So just like you can see in this diagram, we have autotrophs are the producers that have actually the most energy, and as you work your way up through those trophic levels, the tertiary consumers, or those top carnivores, are actually receiving the least amount of energy. So in a typical ecosystem, where producers have 100% of the energy or biomass, the consumer eating those producers actually only receives 10% of that total energy. Then if we have our secondary consumer that's eating the primary consumer, they only receive 1% of that energy. So here's another diagram to show you how those different levels of biomass and our trophic levels work using the C as an example. So in the past, you have studied food chains where you have the sun giving energy to producers, and then you have the producers being consumed by a primary consumer, such as grass being consumed by a grasshopper, primary consumers being consumed by the secondary consumers, like the grasshopper being eaten by a snake, and so on and so forth. So now we're going to take it a step further when we talk about food webs that take all possible paths of the feeding relationships in each trophic level. So essentially we're talking about all of the different options that these organisms have for their food sources within multiple food chains. Where a food chain shows only one path of energy, like you see in this diagram on the right, a food web shows all of the possible paths of energy. So coming up, you are going to put your knowledge to the test and complete a review worksheet, and then later on next week we are going to work on a food web project.